Delegates and our speakers. My name is Anup Dikshit from Concord Biotech Limited. I am responsible for domestic business operations here in Concord Biotech Limited. I would like to welcome as well as greet from the CVL side. We welcome all the delegates and our speakers on this webinar, which is very renowned and senior speakers. One is Dr. Pradeep Rangappa, who is a senior consultant, intensive care physician from Columbia Asia Hospitals, Bangalore. Dr. Pradeep Rangappa will speak on COVID-19 and update, focusing on the latest treatment recommendations like dexamethasone and remdesivir. I'm also very happy to share with all of you that Pradeep Rangappa will also be a moderator for this webinar. We have a speaker, Dr. P. Sen, infectious disease from Apollo Group of Hospitals. Dr. Nambi will give a presentation on current perspective on daptomycin. After these two presentations, we will have a question and answer session. For all the participants, they are welcome to ask questions to both the speakers, and they would be very happy to answer all questions. And post that, we will have a vote of thanks along with a brief introduction from Concord. We'll give you the brief idea what Concord is all about, and we'll close the session. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Pradeep Rangappa to take charge as a moderator and then give the presentation.
So good evening, everyone. So hope my screen is shown there on the. So thank you very much, Anup, for the kind introduction. So I thank Concord for having this session. So friends, as you know, this is a 18th COVID-19 update that I would be taking you through. And the therapeutic armamentarium I would cover is the newer medications that are currently available, which is steroids, which has made some sort of a waves in our intensive care circle, and the newer antivirals. So friends, most of the intensive care trainees would acknowledge that steroids has not been something which is new to us. We have been using it from very long time, almost 2 decades. There has been usage of steroids in various types of ARDS. So it has only come and gone few times. So we will try to see what is the newer evidence that has come. And we will try to draw to light about all the previous evidence that was prevailing. And we have been using steroids. There's nothing absolutely new about role of steroids in ARDS, but it is good to revisit the evidence that is currently available and what is its role in the COVID situation. So I think the whole news was made by this recovery trial, and I'm sure many of you would have read this 2-page sort of a narrative that came as an interim analysis. But yesterday we got a full text of this role of dexamethasone in ARDS. So this particular recovery study has around 6 arms to it. So this particular study enrolled 11,500 patients with 175 hospitals. So this is a big sort of a multicentric randomized controlled trial. So as I mentioned, it was a 6-armed study. So the arms that they're looking into was lopinavir, ritonavir, dexamethasone, hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, tocilizumab, and plasma, convalescent plasma. So it is a large study involving multiple arms comparing each other to see what really confers good benefit with regards to outcome in COVID-19. And friends, most of you would be aware that HCQ was stopped. The HCQ arm was stopped because of the debate that raised because of that Lancet paper, which showed a lot of side effects. So anyway, that is, we leave it to that debate. So right now, our whole interest is in all these other drugs which are still being compared, and the trial is ongoing. So the interim report that came, it basically looked into 6,425 patients which were enrolled to compare dexamethasone with the usual care. So the usual care group, as you see, had 4,321 patients. And when they looked at the mortality, 28-day mortality in the usual care group, The mortality was 41% in mechanically ventilated patients and 25% in the patients who were receiving oxygen, and 13% in patients who were not receiving any of these oxygen support devices. So the thing we need to note is the increased mortality in especially mechanically ventilated and those needing oxygen. So here in this particular recovery study, they used dexamethasone 6 milligram once a day for 10 days. And they used it in 2,104 patients. And this was compared with the usual care group. And what results they found was very, was very impressive. So in this day and age, to show a good mortality benefit is something which is extremely difficult. So here they saw in mechanically ventilated patient, there was 17% reduction in the mortality, and that was statistically significant. So there was reduction in 1/3 of the deaths. And in the group which were receiving oxygen, there was a 1/5 reduction in the death rates. But in the group who was not receiving any oxygen or any oxygen support devices, there was no difference. So it goes to show this steroid seemed to have benefit in sicker patients who are mechanically ventilated or who are on oxygen, and which is what, as intensive care community, we are all interested in, to save lives, because COVID, 80 to 85% can be asymptomatic. So what we are really worried is that 5% who come to ICU, and this study throws light on that spectrum of these patients. And the study also looks into number needed to treat, and then they looked at the number. So if you treat 8 patients with dexamethasone, 1 life can be saved, and treatment of 25 patients who are on oxygen will lead to 1 life that is saved. So this was the essence of this study. And the full paper, it came only yesterday. So the full text of the paper. So this was the table that we could collate from that manuscript. So they looked at 28-day mortality in dexamethasone. As I said, it was 21.6%, and the usual care, it was 24.6%. That was statistically significant. And the secondary outcomes, they looked at the discharge from hospital, and even that was found to be significant. The patients who are on dexamethasone were more likely to be discharged than the usual care, and that was also significant. So 64.6% versus 61.1%. And interestingly, the need for mechanical ventilation also was significantly less. As you see, the need for ventilation and death was of 23.9 versus 25.8. And the need for ventilation was 5.2% versus 7.1% in the usual care. And all those were statistically significant. So it's a pretty impressive sort of a numbers and impressive study where dexamethasone really made inroads and showed benefit with regards to the 28-day mortality, the need for mechanical ventilation, and it facilitated discharges. So that was something very striking in this particular study. And when you look at, if you see this diamond, it moves to the left for all the sick patients who needed oxygen and who needed mechanical ventilation. And that was all statistically significant. So that was the study. So obviously we could raise some apprehension about this particular study with regards to there was not a huge difference, but although as we see, it was powered to look into these 28-day mortality. But just before this study, so there was another big study, which is the largest randomized controlled trial that came looking at the role of dexamethasone in ARDS. So this is what created a lot of excitement for our intensivists. So this was a big study which came from the Spanish group, dexamethasone treatment for the acute respiratory distress syndrome, a multi-center randomized control trial. So this came by Villar group. It came on March 2020. So this was a multicentric randomized control trial looking into 17 ICUs. So here they took patients with moderate to severe ARDS where PaO2 FiO2 was less than or equal to 200. And these were sick patients. As you see, PaO2 FiO2 was less than 200 with FiO2 more than 50% and PEEP more than 10. So it is not like a very Mickey Mouse patients. So they were really sick patients where they have used dexamethasone. And they enrolled the patient once they reached such alarming levels within 24 hours, they included for randomization. And the interventions here, as you see, if you see the recovery trial, they gave 6 milligram dexamethasone. So here they give a much higher dose. So dexamethasone, they gave 20 milligram once a day. So as you know, the conversion is 0.75 milligram dexamethasone is equal to 4 milligram methylprednisolone. For Indians, where we are using methylprednisolone for our COVID patients, it equates to around 106 milligram of methylprednisolone. So they gave 20 milligram dexamethasone from day 1 to day 5. And after that, they weaned it to 10 milligram once a day. and they continued for 10 days. So basically the treatment was given for 10 days. And if you want a conversion of methylprednisolone, around 106 milligram followed by 53 milligram, they gave it for these patients. And the primary outcome, they looked at 28-day ventilatory free days. And the secondary outcome, they looked at 60-day mortality. So what were the results? So they had 277 patients. As I said, this is the largest randomized controlled trial in ARDS where steroids was looked into. So that is the merit that you need to give to this study. So 139 patients were there in dexamethasone group and 138 were there in the control group. And ventilatory free days was more in dexamethasone, which is a good thing. So the more the free days, better it is. And that was statistically significant. And look at the 60-day mortality. 60-day mortality was significantly less in dexamethasone group as compared to the control group. 21% versus 36%, and that was statistically significant. And obviously, some of the Puritans would still argue that dexamethasone may lead to increased risk of infections. And you will see the narrative of the studies that I'll show. None of the studies have shown that at the dose that that is being used for ARDS in these studies and vouching with the evidence, there is no increased risk of infection with these sort of doses. But hyperglycemia was a problem, but it was not statistically significant. And as you see, the newer infections was the same between the two groups. So although some might argue that giving steroids would increase the risk of infection, but in these carefully monitored dose that we give as an infusion, the studies have shown time and again it does not lead to increase in the risk of infection. That is something we need to keep in back of mind. And interestingly, the Spanish trial also showed that the need for prone ventilation in dexamethasone group was significantly less, which means obviously, see, they were on a tip-off point where they had gone to PEEP of 10 and FiO2 of 50. So had they worsened, obviously one would have thought of proning, but the proning was minimized by use of dexamethasone, 20% versus 30%, and that was also statistically significant. And when they looked at SOFA score was lower at day 3, which is also good. And they looked at PaO2, FiO2 improvement. It started creeping up and it was higher at day 6. So these were all the positive findings from this particular Spanish study, which I think this Spanish study, along with this recovery trial, has given a very strong signal to our intensive community about the role of steroids and its immense benefit for its usage in COVID-19 patients. And this is a Kaplan-Meier curve. As you would see, the survival was much better with dexamethasone group. So in the discussions, the authors say, how did dexamethasone help in ARDS? Obviously, we know it reduces the inflammation within the lung, and it significantly improved all the inflammatory cascade that happens at the alveolar level and all the inflammatory exudates that get poured into alveoli. All that was negated is what the authors mentioned. And they did a subgroup analysis to look at how about the death due to multi-organ failure. Even they found that death due to multi-organ failure was significantly less in dexamethasone group as compared to the control group, and that was also statistics. So basically, you got significance in mortality, got significance with regards to the SOFA score and the need for prone ventilation. So I think this was a very strong signal that this study came out. And as I mentioned, the strength of this study was, it was a largest randomized controlled trial. So I don't think there's any trial that is as large as 277 sick ARDS patients who are mechanically ventilated. And they looked at whether all biases were eliminated. So they found there was no bias in this study. There was no selection bias. There was no performance bias. There was no attrition bias, and there was no reporting bias. So these are all the strengths of this particular Spanish study that came about. So these are the two strong studies, recovery and the Spanish study by Vicar et al., which really sent out a strong signal. Yes, I think in ARDS, we should be considering usage of dexamethasone. But as I said, the steroids have been there in our armamentarium for the use in ARDS for more than 2 decades. And the first landmark trial that which we are still looking up to is this particular trial, because I want to cover the whole steroids in ARDS in this narrative so that you go with absolute conviction that should we use steroids in COVID-19 ARDS or not. So the first study, landmark study, came from this Meduri et al., Umberto Meduri. This came in 2007. So almost 15 years back. So here they looked at methylprednisolone infusion in early severe ARDS, randomized controlled trial. This was a randomized controlled trial, 5 hospital ICUs in US. They took 91 patients with ARDS, and methylprednisolone was used within 72 hours of ARDS onset. and 66% of these patients were having sepsis. The primary endpoint they looked at was reduction in the single point lung injury score and extubation at 7 days. So what was the results in this MEDURIS trial? So they had 91 patients, 63 in the methylprednisolone group. Here they gave methylprednisolone as 1 milligram per kg per day as an infusion for 28 days, and they compared with placebo. So there was a reduction in the lung injury score by 1 point more significantly. Basically, the lung inflammatory index that they looked into was significantly lessened in methylprednisolone group as compared to the placebo. 69.8% of the patients had reduction in the lung injury score, and more patients were successfully extubated. 53.9% were successfully extubated as compared to 25% in placebo group. And even mortality was significantly less in this MEDURIS trial, 20.6 versus 42.9, statistically significant. And ICU length of stay also was lower. And duration of mechanical ventilation was lower. And as you see, time and again, every steroid study in ARDS has shown the risk of infection was not high. And this MEDURIS trial even showed that risk of infection was less when compared to the placebo. And the CRP also was lower, because we understand in COVID patients, CRP is very high and indicates cytokine storm. So CRP was lower, and day 7 lung injury score and MODS also was significantly less. So all the endpoints that they looked into had significantly better outcome in methylprednisolone group. And after this MEDURIS trial came the ARDSNet group, which we all consider it as a Bible for ARDS management. That group came out with this another study of role of corticosteroids in NEJM. Until the Spanish trial came, this was the largest study to look at the role of corticosteroids in ARDS. This was done by the ARDSNet group itself. So this was a randomized controlled trial. So they looked at primary endpoint as 60-day mortality, and the secondary endpoints, they looked at ventilatory free days and organ failure free days. And they had 180 patients, because consider this Spanish study, which had 277 patients. So that's why we say it's the largest study. So 180 patients, 89 in methylprednisolone group and 91 in the placebo group. Here, look at the dose they have used. So the dose they have used is a little similar to the Spanish study. If you equate the dexamethasone, 2 milligram per kg they gave as a bolus, followed by 2 milligram per kg as an infusion for 14 days. So here they have divided into 4 doses, 0.5 mg per kg 6 hourly, which literally comes to 2 milligram per kg. They gave for 14 days. So if it is a 60 kg person, they gave 120 milligram as an infusion for 14 days, and they reduced it to 1 milligram per kg for 7 days, and they tapered over days. So this is the dose that they gave in this ARDSNet group. And what were the results? 180 patients, 89 in the early methylprednisolone group. So here, interestingly, this group, they divided ARDS into the early ARDS and late ARDS, and they stratified the study and the administration of methylprednisolone in these groups. So they looked into the results where methylprednisolone was given in early onset ARDS as one arm. The second arm was the one where they looked at role of methylprednisolone when they gave steroids late after the onset of ARDS. So early methylprednisolone usage was when the onset of ARDS was within 13 days, 7 to 13 days. 89 patients were there, placebo 91. So 60-day mortality, there was no difference in the methylprednisolone. It did not achieve statistical significance. They looked at 180-day mortality. There was no difference between early methylprednisolone and placebo. But the study indicated that if you give steroids late after 14 days, the 60-day and 180-day mortality significantly increased. I think this is the practice that we have been following, at least in my unit or in our units, that if it is early ARDS, we have a lower threshold to start steroids. But if they come late in the ARDS, we don't start steroids based on this particular ARDSNet study where it showed increased mortality. And they looked at mechanical ventilation organ failure free days that was high in late methylprednisolone. Again, here you see the risk of infection. Either you start early or late in the type of dosages that is evidenced from these articles, there was no increased risk of infection. So one thing that is very clear is it does not do harm in increasing the risk of infection, if that is the fear anyone would be having. So these are the 4 studies for role of steroids. And now, what do we conclude from these 4 studies? So now you have a recovery trial which says it is beneficial. You have a Spanish trial which says it's beneficial. Then you have MEDURIS trial which says it's beneficial. But this ARDSNet study debunked that and said it may not be. But this is an old study. Then this meta-analysis came, which hopefully will give us a sort of a convincing substantiation that yes, steroids are here to stay. So this was a good meta-analysis which came in 2009, which took in all the 6 studies. So basically here it took all the studies which used methylprednisolone 0.5 to 2 point. It took 5 cohort studies and 4 randomized controlled trials. When independently cohort studies was analyzed, it did not achieve statistical significance. Independently, when RCTs were analyzed, it did not. But when they combined together and did meta-regression analysis, it achieved statistical significance in reducing the mortality. So this is the forest plot, as you would see. So when you only took cohort studies, it did not achieve. But when you combine all the studies, it did achieve statistical significance in reducing mortality. The use of steroids did reduce mortality significantly. And even it did reduce the need for mechanical ventilation with the use of steroids. As you see, the diamond is clearly pushed to the left and favoring the treatment. And even the MOD score, multi-organ dysfunction, significantly was lesser in patients who got steroids. So all in all, as you see, the steroids are here to stay. So now we have a good evidence, at least from the Spanish study, if not for the recovery trial, Spanish study together with the recovery trial, with Meduri's trial, along with these meta-analysis, we have a strong signal that it does not cause harm. If at all the studies have shown it increases the risk of glycemia, but infection risk, absolutely not in the dosage we use. So I think we are reasonably justified in considering usage of steroids at this point of time, considering and collating all the current evidence and collating all the previous available good quality studies in ARDS. So we'll move to the remdesivir because I said this talk is on steroids and the newer antivirals. I'll cover remdesivir briefly. So remdesivir, which is now come which will be available in our markets, which will possibly be included as part of our protocol, is a prodrug. And prodrug, it leads to ATP analog. And this remdesivir came into limelight in 2014, where it was used mainly for Ebola virus. But if the question is whether was it successful in Ebola, it had a very, very low efficacy against Ebola. It did not possibly made a huge difference in Ebola. In 2017, this remdesivir was touted and was found out to be effective against coronavirus. As we know, there are different coronavirus, SARS coronavirus. So that hypothesis was applied to this COVID-19. And generally, it has been postulated that remdesivir is effective against single-stranded RNA viruses. And it does have effect on certain key enzymes of SARS-CoV-2. So is what has been hypothesized, and then this was incorporated as part of the trials which we will look into. And the main mechanism of action, how remdesivir works, is it stops viral replication. So how does it act? How does remdesivir act? So as you know, the coronavirus has a lot of these spike proteins. And if you consider this as a cell membrane, it binds to the ACE2 receptors, which is present on the cell membrane. And there is endocytosis that happens of this virus into these lysosomes, and they get incorporated in these endolysosomes. And then once within the cell, this virus releases RNA. So it releases the RNA that is present within the virus. And this viral RNA starts replicating. And this replication is mediated by this RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. So this is a ribosome which helps in replication of these and makes multiple copies of this viral RNA. And once the multiple copies are formed, these copies are sort of assembled to form a new virus, and this new virus exits the cells. It will destroy the cells and they'll all come out and starts harming the body. So this is pretty much how the COVID-19 typically behaves in a human being. So how does remdesivir act? So remdesivir, as we know, it's a prodrug. It is not an active drug in its form. Once it is given, once it is administered, the active form is this, whatever numerical coding they have given, GS441524. This is an active component. So this active component, what it does is it gets embedded into the RNA. So whatever RNA sequencing is formed, it gets embedded. Because it gets embedded, it prevents the further incorporation of nucleotides and prevents the completion of the RNA transcription that happens. So this is a typical way where it obstructs the formation of multiple copies of RNA because the nucleotides cannot sort of sequence themselves to form multiple copies. But having said that, the virus is very clever. It produces something called 3,5-exoribonuclease, which can deactivate this sort of a remdesivir. So that is something which we need to keep in mind, that it is not still a Brahmastra, but this is the way it pretty much acts. I'll just show a nice video that will show you the mechanism of action of remdesivir. Very nice video. It is present on YouTube.
नोज से जाता है ना ये?
I think can someone put on
अलायंस करके है, उसको मैंने उसको लॉगिन किया था, मैंने कभी बनाया था, उसने काफी ये बताया।
Can we stop the background voice? Yeah, so I think that cartoon pretty much tells you how remdesivir gets attached to the RNA sequencing and prevents further incorporation of the nucleotides. So I don't know whether you got the audio well, because there's a good audio. You can check it on the YouTube. So what's the pharmacology of remdesivir? It's 200 mg once a day as a IV infusion, followed by 100 mg once a day for 9 days. And absorption, it is found that when you give it as 10 milligram per kg, it gets absorbed into the eyes and CSF and to the testes within 4 hours. Adverse effects, it can cause nausea, vomiting, and predominantly rising in the AST and ALT, or transaminitis is the side effect. So let's look into whether remdesivir has any hope in COVID situation patients. So this was the first study that came on remdesivir. This was a randomized controlled trial that came from Chinese authors. This was published in Lancet on 16th May 2020. It's a double-blind, multicentric, randomized controlled trial. So they took patients with symptom onset less than or equal to 12 days for enrollment, which means they took this patient little early on when they had symptoms. I think the key essence of using any of these antiviral drugs is to use it early when the viral replication is happening. They took the patients with saturation less than 94, which means they're all symptomatic and the oxygenation is affected, with PaO2, FiO2 less than 300 with radiological changes. So the dosage they gave was 200 mg once a day, followed by 100 mg once a day for 9 days. And concomitantly, there was a usage of lopinavir, ritonavir, interferon, and corticosteroids. So the primary endpoint was to look at time to clinical improvement at day 28. So this was the endpoint that they looked at. And they looked at this clinical improvement on a scale of 6. So 1 was very bad, where they discharged and improved, and 6 was death. So that was the clinical scoring they gave. So what was the results? 237 patients, 158 in the remdesivir group, 79 in the placebo group. The time to clinical improvement, there was no difference between the remdesivir and placebo group. But in the subgroup where they looked at the patient where symptom onset was less than 10 days, they found there was a faster recovery time, and that was statistically significant. And adverse events, as you see, there was not much difference between remdesivir and the control group. So this was the study which did not show a huge, this was not powered to look at the mortality. So they just looked at the symptom improvement. So the whole essence of the study is if you use remdesivir where symptom onset is less than 10 days, there is a faster recovery time with remdesivir when compared to the placebo. That's all it showed. And then this was the second paper that came in NEJM by Grain et al. On 10th April 2020. 53 patients were looked into. This was a cohort study. This was not a randomized controlled trial. Saturation less than 94%. So this was a multicentric trial. 22 patients from US, 22 from Europe, and 9 from Japan. So 57% of these patients were mechanically ventilated, and 8% of these patients were on ECMO. So what did they find? Improvement in oxygen happened in significant proportion of patients, 68%, and 57% were successfully extubated. And patients on mechanical ventilator, mortality was reduced. It was 18%. As you saw in the previous studies, mortality can be anywhere hovering around 40 to 50%. So mortality was less. And mortality in non-mechanical ventilator also significantly less, and discharge 47% were successfully discharged, and death rate was 13%. It was just a cohort study looking into the effect of remdesivir in these patients, and they found that this is a drug which could be used for which should be obviously tested in a larger randomized controlled trial to make logical conclusion. Then this particular trial came on 27th May 2020 in NEJM. where they compared remdesivir usage in 5 days for 5 days and 10 days and saw what was its effect. So this study was supported by Gilead, which makes remdesivir. This was a randomized controlled trial. So they took patients. So all the remdesivir trials took patients who needed oxygen. So that is something all the listeners should keep in mind, not to be used in an asymptomatic patients who are not on oxygen. And the study looked at patients who had radiological changes of COVID. And they looked primary endpoint, they looked at day 14 clinical improvement. Again, like a previous study, on the scale of 7 they took. So here they had 237 patients, 200 in remdesivir group, 197. So day 14 clinical improvement by 2 points was more in remdesivir group than the control group, not statistically significant. And it appeared, the trend appeared like more patients were discharged, not statistically significant between the remdesivir and control group. And discharge of the patients with symptoms within 10 days. Again, like the previous study, if patients are included in the study within 10 days, the Chinese study we showed that discharge was much better. 62% were discharged as compared to the control group. And mortality, although the signal is towards maybe it may lessen, but it did not show statistical significance with regards to mortality difference. And duration of recovery also, there was no statistically significant. This study basically showed only signals or trend that it may lessen, but only, again, the effect was more pronounced in patients where remdesivir was administered within 10 days of onset of symptoms, and it echoes the same sort of findings that came out from the Chinese trial. And they did a post hoc analysis. This is very important. And what they found is they compared between the remdesivir 5 days and 10 days. And when you look at the 5 days and 10 days group, the patients who are mechanically ventilated, day 14 deaths was more in the group where remdesivir was given for 5 days as compared to the group where remdesivir was given for 10 days. So basically what it shows is in patients who are very sick or mechanically ventilated, it sends out a signal that maybe remdesivir has to be used for a longer time because it showed reduced in mortality. But this was a post hoc analysis. But in non-invasive ventilation and the HFNO, the day 14 deaths, either you give for 5 days or 10 days, it did not show any difference. So this particular randomized controlled trial really looked into 5 days of remdesivir versus 10 days. So if you compare in a non-sick patients who are not on ventilator, 5 days appears good enough from the previous table. As you see, 5 days is good enough with regards to achieving your endpoints. But when you have a sicker patients on mechanical ventilator, so this particular table you see, so there were 40 patients who sort of a 40% who died, as opposed to the 17% who died when remdesivir was given for 10 days. So that had a statistical significance. It just sends out a signal. If it is a sicker patient, maybe you have to consider giving it for 10 days. And the adverse effects they reported, 9% had nausea, vomiting, 7% had transaminitis, and 8% had worsening respiratory failure, and 7% had sort of a constipation. So these were sort of effectively all the side effects that they witnessed. So I'll just end with a couple of slides. Favipiravir. So these are some of the small studies that has come. So this was a Russian study. Again, favipiravir showed that the duration of symptoms can be minimized. This was a Russian study which showed duration of symptoms to be reduced as compared with the other group, with the placebo group. And this was a study from Japan. Again, it showed clinical improvement with favipiravir up to 88% by day 14 of treatment. And this was a Chinese study where they showed significant improvement in the radiological imaging with the use of favipiravir. And Chinese study where again it showed superiority to an umifenovir. So these are some of the small studies where they have basically looked at favipiravir for mild to moderate symptomatic patients, and they found earlier symptom resolution and better radiological clearance. So they all said rapid reduction in viral loads, faster fever resolution, faster resolution of CT images, and faster clinical improvement. So the role of favipiravir is mainly to start early is a key in COVID virus, because as you see in the early part of the disease, there is a huge viral replication, and the body's immune response is not overwhelming as it would be in the later phase. But if you do not tackle this viral replication, then you have this very turbulent and stormy sort of a immune response, which leads to all the organ dysfunction. Our whole effort is to subdue this viral replication so that we do not lead to this violent, turbulent immune response, which leads to organ dysfunction and death in the later stage. So the dosage of favipiravir that is recommended is 1800 milligram twice a day on day 1, followed by 800 milligram twice a day for 13 days. So the total duration of treatment is for 14 days. And now it is made available by the pharma companies in India. So this is something you could look for. And the mechanism of action of favipiravir is very similar to remdesivir. The active component is ribofuranosyl triphosphate, which again enters the cell and prevents the replication of the viruses by inhibiting RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. It's very similar to the remdesivir. So just I'll end with the last couple of 1 or 2 slides about our experience in Karnataka and how we are doing. So this is the current situation. In India, our case fatality is around 3.28%. And in Karnataka, how are we doing? So if you look at it, see our case fatality rate in Karnataka is 1.54%, and Tamil Nadu has beaten us with case fatality. It is much lesser, and Andhra Pradesh. So since I'm from Karnataka, I'm interested in how our state is doing. Telangana is more than us, and Delhi is 3.45%. So when we look at Karnataka, the 28 districts where we 2 hospitals are doing tele-ICU, our case fatality rate is very less. It's 0.93%, but the city is not doing well because overall in India, cities are what are overwhelmed and our case fatality rates are high in cities. In Bangalore, it is 4.85. And if you look at our districts, these are the districts where we do rounds for all our COVID patients. So far, we have seen around 3,290 patients over more than 10 weeks. And we had 18 deaths, and the districts that we are covering, case fatality rate is very, very low, 0.54. So I have to upload all the district that we are doing rounds. I think they are the true COVID warriors. I hope someone is logged in. So we're doing exceedingly well in all the districts that we are covering. And if you look at metro cities, Bangalore is not doing great because Ahmedabad is tops the list with case fatality of 7.0, followed by Mumbai, followed by Bangalore. And Chennai, as you see, is doing much better than Bangalore at this point of time with case fatality rate. So thank you very much. So I will hand over to Dr. Senthur to do his talk, and then we will take questions together with both talks. Thank you very much. Over to you, Senthur.
Very good evening. I hope you are able to see my screen, Dr. Pradeep Rangappa. You're able to see?
Yeah, we can see. You are very audible.
Thank you. I think 2 diverse topics, thanks to Concord for this webinar. I think nice overview with updating literature with COVID by Dr. Pradeep, and then totally focused topic on daptomycin. So let me go through it in the next 15-20 minutes. I'm just presenting with a case scenario. A 25-year-old lady from Ranchi, Jharkhand, who is a housewife with no significant comorbids or past history. She presents with a history of fever, cough, sputum of around 1.5 months duration with a weight loss of around 5 kilograms. The fever is moderate to high grade with chills, intermittent, no skin rashes, no joint pains. Cough is with mucoid expectorations, no hemoptysis, progressive fatigability, dyspnea, but there is no orthopnea, PMD. And then with respect to the treatment details, she underwent MTP 3 weeks prior to the symptom onset. That was one history that she has had. Evaluation done at elsewhere showed a chest X-ray with multiple ill-defined opacities. This was not in India. This was in 2019, so we don't need to think about COVID. The HRCT chest showed multiple cavity lesions. There was mild anemia with leukocytosis, platelets on the lower side, and the liver function test normal. The urine routine was normal. Ultrasound abdomen showed mild hepatomegaly. Other workup for vasculitis, HIV was negative. So the treating physician thought the 6-week history of fever, cough, weight loss, and chest X-ray infiltrates, even though the sputum AFB and gene export was negative, they chose to give a trial of empiric ATT. Probably most physicians or pulmonary physicians would do that in India, and they'd be right in most of the situations. This was the X-ray, but you could see bilateral inhomogeneous opacities involving almost all the lung fields in a young female, and a CT scan of the chest that was done showed some cavitary infiltrates, nodules and cavitary infiltrates. I will just project a closer view. And I know that with COVID, we are looking at peripheral ground glass infiltrates, but this lady did not have any ground glassing. All she had was nodules and cavities. So this is the background 6-week history of fever, cough, and the nodules or cavitary lung infiltrates in a young lady and on ATT and not doing well. So this patient had presented to the pulmonologist at our hospital, where they chose to do a bronchoscopy, which was inconclusive. The BAL, Gram-Stein, fungal smear, the AFB smear, the gene expert, all negative, and no malignant cells. And then they decided to do a CT-guided biopsy of the cavitary lung lesion. Unfortunately, she developed some pneumothorax with hemodynamic instability post-procedure, and that makes her land in the ICU, where she was started on IV vancomycin and ceftriaxone sulbactam, pending cultures. And the lung tissue, which was sent for biopsy, had grown Staphylococcus aureus. And remember, this is a 6-week history in a young female. And the first thing that we need to see with the Staphylococcus aureus report is look into cefoxitin or oxacillin sensitive, and that was resistant. So we're dealing with an methicillin resistant Staph aureus. This is from the lung tissue biopsy. And this lady had an echocardiogram done, and this was the echocardiogram finding. She had a huge vegetation attached to the tricuspid valve, size of around 3.2 centimeter into 1.9 centimeter. The RARV was dilated and there was a severe tricuspid regurgitation. Otherwise, other valves are all fine. So we are adding more information to the story. There is a Staph aureus in the lung and there is a tricuspid valve vegetations. And the blood cultures at the time of ICU stay, what was sent had grew MRSA, methicillin resistant Staph aureus, just similar to the one that is there in the lung tissue. And if you look into the vancomycin, daptomycin, linezolid, teicoplanin sensitivity that is reported, a good lab will always report the MICs so that you would know which would be the best drug. And if you see in this report, vancomycin MIC is less than 0.5, daptomycin MIC is 0.25, linezolid MIC is 2, the teicoplanin MIC is less than 0.5. So everything seems to be fine. So what do we have is a tricuspid valve endocarditis with septic pulmonary emboli due to MRSA. So this is what our patient has. So why did this patient develop this is a question. When you go back to the history, this lady underwent a medical termination of pregnancy. At that time they had put in a peripheral IV line. Unfortunately, after the IV line, she developed a bad phlebitis, and that was not given so much of importance. And then we think that probably the phlebitis is a cause for the MRSA, bacteremia, seeding on to the tricuspid valve and from the valve to the lungs. So when you look at the MRSA, we're looking at two phenotypes. One is a community acquired MRSA, the other one is a healthcare associated MRSA. And both are actually genotypically different because with the community acquired MRSA, you're looking at the PVL gene production, and they are less likely to be resistant to multiple classes of antibiotics. And in general, you would see that in patients who do not have any comorbidities. And typical presentation would be skin and soft tissue infections, necrotizing fasciitis, and pneumonia. That is what you would see with community acquired MRSA. Whereas a hospital acquired MRSA is typically you would see with line infections or surgical site infections. That would be the predominant presentation of hospital acquired MRSA. So looking into MRSA, is it a problem? Yeah, to an extent in India. I know that India is a land of gram negatives and we have a lot of problems with gram negatives. But if you look into the data, the INSAR data on MRSA, Staph aureus, which is a multi-center study looking into around 26,000 Staph aureus isolates. When they looked into the overall MRSA prevalence, it was around 40%. So there are 100 Staph aureus isolates in this country. And with this multi-center study, what they found was 40% was methicillin resistant Staph aureus. And of course, the typical syndromes were skin and soft tissue infections, bloodstream infections, and pneumonias. So what are all the risk factors for MRSA infections? Extremes of age group, children less than 2 years, any pediatric age group, PICU pneumonias, you would always think of MRSA, as well as adults greater than 65 years, especially with pneumonias, someone with a recent influenza-like illness, or to make it simple, any pneumonia requiring community-acquired pneumonia, requiring ICU hospitalization, you would be thinking of MRSA. And if there is history of colonization with MRSA, in the past, or family members having history of MRSA, or if there is a furuncle or a boil, then you would always think of MRSA cause for the problem. So coming back to our patient, tricuspid valve endocarditis with septic pulmonary emboli due to MRSA. So what would be the drug of choice? Are we going to give vancomycin, teicoplanin, linezolid, or daptomycin? These are the typical anti-MRSA drugs that we have in our armamentarium. Let us go through each one of it. Look into this vancomycin and teicoplanin. As far as endocarditis is concerned, vancomycin is time tested and is being studied well. But with respect to clinical failure and microbiological failure, you compare these two drugs, which has been in the market for a long time, there is no significant differences. Of course, with teicoplanin, we have less adverse effects, lower nephrotoxicity, and lower Redman syndrome. And probably teicoplanin is not inferior to vancomycin with regard to efficacy. But of course, with adverse events, teicoplanin is much better than vancomycin. So what are the alternatives to the glycopeptides? The vancomycin and teicoplanin, we have linezolid, which is, we have oral preparation. It has got a good soft tissue penetration. It is a bacteriostatic drug, and it is not drug not approved in the treatment of bacteremias. And then you have daptomycin, which is probably a new class of antibiotic, which has been there for more than a decade now, which is rapidly bactericidal and is well studied for bloodstream infections. A drug like tigecycline, which is again has an MRSA action, but it is too broad a drug to be used for an MRSA therapy because it covers a lot of other things which you do not want, like anaerobes and gram-negative coverage with tigecycline. So I would never think of using tigecycline for MRSA coverage. So coming back to our patient, this patient was on vancomycin, and blood cultures were repeated over the next 1 week, did not show the clearance of MRSA, and patient continues to be febrile. So what do we do next? So we have a tricuspid valve endocarditis with 1 week of vancomycin. The blood cultures have not cleared. So what do we do? Should we switch vancomycin to teicoplanin, check the vancomycin trough level? Unfortunately, the test is not easily available at multiple centers. Or no, we need to do a source control because it's a huge vegetation sitting in the tricuspid valve. So call the cardiothoracic surgeon. But generally the cardiothoracic surgeons are generally not that keen to do a tricuspid valve replacement. You would always, endocarditis of the tricuspid valve, you would always say, try to treat medically. Then that is how would be the response in most of the situation. Or should we switch the vancomycin to daptomycin? That seems to be a reasonable choice. The only hitch is because this patient also has a pneumonia. So will the daptomycin reach the lung is the question. If we're looking at treating the endocarditis, the right-sided endocarditis, then daptomycin is again a very good choice for that situation. So the vancomycin trough level on the 4th day of vancomycin was 3.04. You're trying to aim a trough level of around 15 to 20, but this patient's on the 4th day of vancomycin is around 3.04. So the vancomycin dose was increased from 1 gram twice daily to 2 gram twice daily. With that dose on the 7th day, you could see this is the vancomycin trough level. So this was a lady who was weighing 50 kilograms with a normal renal function and getting around 4 grams of vancomycin, but still you would not able to achieve the trough levels. And it is not about only the biochemical report there. This patient was not doing well too in terms of fever resolution, nor clearance of bacteremia. So this is a practical problem. So what do we do? Should we use teicoplanin? Should we use daptomycin? Or should I call the cardiothoracic surgeon for a source control? So these are all the questions that had to go through our mind. We chose to use daptomycin at that time because we thought that the lung involvement was secondary to the heart valve involvement. So if the heart valve infection is taken care of properly, it would get better. And of course, we thought the size of the vegetation in the tricuspid valve is too huge. It's around 3 centimeters. And no way you will be able to clear that with medical management. So this patient was advised to undergo tricuspid valve replacement, and that was done in this case too. So going on to the individual drugs, vancomycin, as I said, is time tested, well studied for bacteremias, endocarditis, decent CNS penetration. Whereas the minus points would be is you're unsure about the therapeutic concentration as demonstrated in this case, where you do not know whether the dose that you give is good enough to give a therapeutic clearance. And there are reports to say that in this case, the vancomycin MIC was less than 0.5. That is good, but the cutoff is around 2. There are reports to say that when the vancomycin MIC is between 1 to 2, it may not translate to clinical success. The failure rates are much higher when your vancomycin MIC is more than 1. And it is definitely not a good drug for methicillin sensitive Staph aureus. And of course, among all the agents, it's much more nephrotoxic. Teicoplanin is definitely less toxic, excellent results with pneumonia, skin and soft tissue infections, and bacteremia. And it could be a choice for outpatient antibiotic therapy too, OPAT, because it can be given as once daily. And since it is less toxic, you can now monitor it easily as an outpatient antibiotic therapy. And this drug was never used in the United States of America. So you don't have good literature support to use this drug freely. And of course, this drug does not have any CNS penetration. So when compared to vancomycin, it does not score over in the treatment of meningitis. Linezolid is a very good drug, excellent oral bioavailability. So you got both IV as well as oral. A very good drug for skin and soft tissue infections and pneumonia. The CNS penetration is good. It has antitoxin effect because of the protein synthesis inhibiting action, but it is not approved as an empiric therapy for bacteremia. So if you're looking at treatment of bacteremias, linezolid is not a good drug to do and is a very toxic drug. When we try giving linezolid for more than 10 days, you're looking at side effects like cytopenias, neuropathy, lactic acidosis. Again, in an ICU patient, when we use IV linezolid, it adds a lot of volume, especially if your patient is under volume restriction. Giving IV linezolid 600 milligram twice daily will add up to around 700 ml of IV preparation being infused. So that is something, a problem in patients with cardiac failure and renal disease. Going on to daptomycin, which is belongs to the class of drug known as the lipopeptide, which acts at the cell wall and cell membrane, and it does not has any cross resistance with other classes of drugs, and is an excellent gram-positive drug. It covers MRSA and it covers MSSA well, and it covers BRE decently. It is bactericidal and it is 90% bound to plasma proteins. Again, a convenient dosing in terms of once daily. I think the package insert would say 6 milligram per kilogram, but in life-threatening situations, you may go up to give around 8 to 10 milligram per kilogram per day with daptomycin. Look into this in vitro study that was published way before, comparing linezolid, vancomycin, and daptomycin in terms of their in vitro killing power. And what was demonstrated in this study was daptomycin was far better when compared to linezolid and vancomycin. So daptomycin is rapidly bactericidal. It's an excellent empiric choice, especially for soft tissue infections, because it covers MSSA well. There is decent data to say that it is not inferior in the management of MSSA. It is approved for skin and soft tissue infections, diabetic foot infections, bacteremias, right-sided endocarditis. When the vanc MIC is greater than 1, it's the preferred agent. And again, this drug I prefer to use as an outpatient antibiotic therapy in our patients with endocarditis, because they're going to require around 4 to 6 weeks of therapy. Once the initial management goes off, you are looking at putting in a PICC line and then giving them as an outpatient therapy. In that way, this drug scores over. But the minus points is it cannot be used for pneumonia because daptomycin gets destroyed by the pulmonary surfactants. So it cannot be used for pneumonias. Among all the gram-positive drugs, it's much more costlier when compared to the other drugs. That is a minor side effect, minor issue for me. And then we have to monitor the CPK. So daptomycin can cause myositis, times rhabdomyolysis. So any patients on long-term daptomycin would require a weekly once or a weekly twice CPK being monitored. So every drug that we have as an MRSA drug has its own plus and minus. And of course, you need to look into what is your site of problem too. So with all the drugs like vancomycin, teicoplanin, the bloodstream infections, vanco, teco, and dapto are all fine. With the pneumonia, probably I would say linezolid has got much robust data. It's with soft tissue penetration, lung tissue. Teicoplanin is fine. Vancomycin not a good drug for pneumonias. Daptomycin we cannot use for pneumonias. Skin and soft tissue infections and bone infections, teicoplanin, linezolid, daptomycin all are good. The urinary tract infections, vancomycin, teicoplanin is very good. With CSF meningitis, probably linezolid is a better drug than vancomycin in terms of penetration, but you may not have data supporting it. Data is with respect to vancomycin. Inferiority in treating MSSA. This is very important. When you see a skin and soft tissue infection, there is a 40% chance it could be Staph aureus, which is MRSA. There is a 60% chance which could be MSSA also. So it's very important to choose a drug that would work equally well for both MSSA and MRSA. In that, probably daptomycin scores better when compared to the other exclusive gram-positive drugs. The take-home messages would be the necrotizing pneumonia, skin and soft tissue infections are important gram-positive syndromes. Any patient with Staph aureus bacteremia, we have to rule out endocarditis. I didn't touch upon methicillin-sensitive Staph aureus. Let me reiterate that none of these anti-MRSA drugs are drugs of choice for MSSA. The drugs of choice for an MSSA bacteremia is either IV cefazolin or flucloxacillin. For MRSA bacteremia as a routine, we should be either using vancomycin or teicoplanin, but daptomycin would be the drug of choice when the vancomycin MIC is greater than 1. And I think that's my last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Senthu. That was an excellent presentation, taking through a nice illustrative case. I think what interested me is, albeit we know that daptomycin may not be very effective against the lung, but here it was a clinical call that you made about superseding the bacteremia over the lung infiltrates, which we completely agree, because lung can have infiltrates due to different ALI that may be happening due to bacteremia. So that was a very astute clinical call and good clinical management what you have narrated, Senthu. So if anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand, and we'll just go through the chat box about questions. Okay, so host, do you have anyone raising the hand? Because I can't see anyone raising the hand here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
you can unmute them.
This is one question where one anonymous attendee says that any drug. Hello.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Tell me. Yes, you are audible, Anupji.
Yeah.
I think your internet, there's an issue, sir.
Dexamethasone, remdesivir.
Yeah, I'll read that question. They've asked whether there is any drug interaction of dexamethasone and remdesivir. So as far as I'll take input from Senthur as well. My knowledge goes on this. I know there is a WhatsApp circulation happening that they interfere with enzyme induction. But if you see the Chinese article that came in Lancet, which was a randomized controlled trial of remdesivir, there they have used concomitantly other drugs like lopinavir, ritonavir, and dexamethasone as well. And it is clearly mentioned they were used concomitantly with those drugs as well. But at this point of time, I wouldn't be in a position to say if there is any evidence to suggest there is interactions. Dr. Senthur, you have any comments on that?
I think there may be a minor interaction between dexamethasone and remdesivir, but no one knows the significance of it. So our practice right now is when we use remdesivir for our patients, which has been our practice in the last 7 to 8 days, that we are getting remdesivir through compassionate patient use program. We are avoiding to use dexamethasone. Instead, we use methylprednisolone. So that is what we've been doing. If you ask me for the evidence base for it, we do not know. It's more of fear, and then probably we don't want to miss out something. That is why we are doing. And there is another safer option, methylprednisolone.
Yeah, I completely agree, because in India, even in our Karnataka state where we are using steroids, we are predominantly using methylprednisolone. The distinct advantage is it's a little short acting and more lung specific for us. And the previous trials that have been done was with methylprednisolone. So we also been using methylprednisolone in more of this lung situation. So in that we could possibly negate this interaction if at all there is any. At this point of time, it appears like more of hypothesis. There's no strong evidence showing that signal of interaction, but we need to look into it, because there's nowhere in the literature that this interaction is mentioned in any of these remdesivir trials that have come out. So I think the second question or a comment someone has made is, I feel methylprednisolone is still better where methylprednisolone deposition is more in the lungs than DEXA. So we agree with that. So Senthur, you have any comment on that? Or you agree
No,
with that?
I think except for the recovery trial data from UK, the US is predominantly using actually methylprednisolone in their treatment protocol. So I'm comfortable using methylprednisolone if you ask me.
Yeah. Yeah, so are we, Senthur. So we are using only methylprednisolone, but in certain districts where procurement of that may have been a problem and DEXA is easily available, we have said you go ahead and use it. So the third question is most of it seems to be related to COVID. Is favipiravir approved by ICMR? Is it included in any protocol by any country for COVID? Senthur, you can give your comments and I'll add in because
I think favipiravir is not approved by ICMR, and as far as the protocol inclusion in any country, probably I think in Japan or Russia it has been tried, but I don't think it is a automatic inclusion in any kind of protocols in those countries too.
Yeah, I think from what I am aware, DCGI has approved favipiravir because Glenmark and few other pharmas have produced, isn't it? But whether ICMR has incorporated this as a part of a COVID-19 protocol, the answer is no at this point of time. But my suspicion is it will be soon included, isn't it, Senthur, in the COVID-19 protocol?
No one really knows.
Some stage.
Yeah. The thing is, it has been studied in small numbers only for mild or moderate infections. Again, taking so many tablets per day, I'm not sure. First day you'll have to take 18 tablets, and then you'll have to take around 8 tablets for 14 days. Not sure how many of those patients with mild infections will be motivated enough to take it. So as far as favipiravir is concerned, I would probably suggest to wait for more data or approval from some other recognized body and then decide on its routine use.
Yeah, so I think one situation where I could see possibly this may start getting included at some point of time because it's available is because in mild cases who are asymptomatic or moderate, who are not needing oxygen, Senthur. So these are the patients where HCQ seems to be prevailing as a part of mainstay drug, isn't it? And we know that HCQ's evidence is sort of slowly fading away. And once we start getting reports from various trials about HCQ not having huge benefit, my belief or suspicion is that this favipiravir may replace that HCQ as a armamentarium in mild symptomatic or moderate who are not needing oxygen. I think that would be my suspicion. So what do you think, Senthur?
I think it would come that way. It's not about doctors or clinicians are 100% convinced and they're going to write it. There are a lot of ways in which we prescribe. It could be the media pressure, patient pressure, WhatsApp pressure. So there are many other pressures when you treat COVID patients. That would probably may force clinicians to think about using favipiravir, especially in the outpatient management.
I think the other question is, since steroids are nothing but endogenous hormones, can a baseline estimation of corticosteroids like thyroid hormones help in stratifying people who could be at a risk? I think for this, I would say steroids in ARDS is predominantly used as more as an anti-inflammatory effect. And because we do certain markers in COVID and when these markers are high, which are indicative of hyperinflation that may have happened. So that is where its role is being touted to be used in ARDS. So it is not about replenishing the steroids like in septic shock. So it is the steroids to alleviate the inflammatory cascade is what it is being used for. So Senthur, you have thoughts on that?
No, I don't think, I'm not sure regarding it.
Yeah, so I think that is the hypothesis in ARDS, not replacing subnormal cortisol levels. So will stimulation test for adrenal cortex help? No, because the whole reason we give is more as an anti-inflammatory. So someone has asked, maybe this is for more, what is your comment on dexamethasone versus methylprednisolone after recovery results? Which drug you will prefer and in what dose? I think both of us agree, Senthur, isn't it, that we prefer methylprednisolone over dexamethasone. because it is more lung specific, shorter acting. And we use the equivalent dose. So dexamethasone per se, at a molecular level, does not have any superiority over methylprednisolone.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
we would prefer methylprednisolone. Even our state protocol, we have amended our state protocol with methylprednisolone. In case of non-availability, we may use Dexa. Senthur, your comments?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think one study should not change our practice that easily. And there is nothing much to choose between these two drugs. My personal take is to prefer methylprednisolone. But if someone wants to use dexamethasone, definitely I'm not against it.
Yeah. So this question is for you, Senthur. Role of levodopa difloxacin for MRSA in present scenario. This for you, Senthur. I have no clue.
That's a newer drug which is being studied for MRSA, levonorfloxacin. And I think there was a data from CMC Vellore. I'm not sure if the drug is available thing, but it would be another drug which will be useful in the management of MRSA infections.
I just got a call. I think Wockhardt is, coming out with this drug.
Wockhardt is there.
So you have enough evidence, Dr. Senthur, on levonorfloxacin?
There is good in vitro data, definitely.
Yeah, the reason is we had another drug called arbicacin, which came some time ago for MRSA. But I don't think people caught on with a lot of popularity with that drug. So what are your thoughts on these newer drugs for MRSA?
I think any new drug that gets introduced should be studied in vitro. So if the lab is not in a position to check whether the drug would work or not in vitro, I don't think we should be using the drug freely. That was a problem with arbicacin. So you don't have any kind of interpretive criteria in trying to say whether it is sensitive, intermediate, resistant. That is the case, it becomes very difficult to use a drug, especially when you have other choices for managing the same infection.
Yeah. So this question also is for you. Please tell about Zavicefta penetration in proven joint infections. I know it's a little offbeat question. It's not.
I don't know why this question is being asked here. It has not been studied for joint infections. Okay, it has been studied. Zavicefta is ceftazidime avibactam. So it has been studied only in pneumonias, intra-abdominal infections, and complicated UTIs. So we don't have any good data, but there is post-marketing data saying that you can use it, but no one really knows well.
Yeah. So again, another question on favipiravir, which I think we have answered, is favipiravir to be used for only mild to moderate and remdesivir for severe infections. I think that is how it seems to have been positioned. Remdesivir, as you see, if you see the 3 trials that we spoke, it has been used only in patients who start needing oxygen, and there are imaging changes suggestive of lung infiltrates, and favipiravir for mild to moderate. Senthur, your thoughts?
Yeah, but I think a word of caution. We have to understand that none of these drugs will be wonder drugs. These are not like antibiotics. Okay, you give and you expect very good recovery. These are all experimental therapies. So we have to be very clear when we use all these drugs. So in mild infections, anyway, most of these patients will get better on their own. It's only for those hospitalized patients we need to have some kind of data. The problem is it's not used alone in most of these situations. It's kind of, you can antiviral with an anti-inflammatory with supportive therapy. So many things are there. So it's very difficult to pick out, okay, this drug made a difference in the whole recovery. But given the paucity of data, when you're dealing with sick patients, I agree that we'll be using remdesivir for the ICU hospitalized patients. Favipiravir, anyway, it's available only as an oral drug. So naturally, you would not use that in an ICU sick hospitalized patient. Probably you may be using it for mild infections or moderate infections.
Good. Another question for you, Senthur. MSSA proven bacteremia, in spite we know to change to flucloxacin or cefazolin, but primary consultants, including cardiologists, not happy with both cefazolin and flucloxacin. Any new guidelines in ICMR?
I don't think ICMR has come up with any guidelines on Staph aureus bacteremia. I think this is well evidence-based. Any literature, if you're going to look into it, you will know that for MSSA, you'll have to use either cefazolin or flucloxacillin, and not use either Vanco or Tico, because they are not the best drugs for MSSA. And people think only MRSA is bad. MSSA is as equally as bad as MRSA. So we have to keep that in mind. So we have to use flucloxacefazolin for MSSA bacteremia. I think we have to convince the other consultants regarding that.
Yeah. So there's another question for you. Can we give 2 MRSA combination drugs in severe cases?
I think 2 MRSA combination drugs, in the sense the problem is vancomycin of the same class. One thing that we can do is give glycopeptide plus clindamycin, something like that. Okay, that is a toxin synthesis inhibitor, so protein synthesis inhibitor. So it may have an antitoxin effect. So you can use a glycopeptide plus clindamycin. That is one option. But to put that as a routine treatment algorithm, I don't think we have enough support to do that. But that's a good practice idea, especially with bad soft tissue infections, necrotizing pneumonia, where you may be using a beta-lactam or a glycopeptide along with a toxin synthesis inhibitor like clindamycin.
So I think one basic question again, which we are looking for an answer is, sir, is HCQ effective in treatment of COVID? Hydroxychloroquine. So Senthur, I leave your comments for that.
I don't think so.
Okay. Are you using it in your protocol?
So. No, we are not using it.
Okay. Okay. So I think that most other questions, side effects of remdesivir, someone has asked, but it's mentioned twice in my talk, mainly nausea, vomiting, and some transaminitis and some constipation. I think these are the only side effects that I could get in literature. Senthur, you want to add any other side effects of those?
I think that's hepatotoxicity, and then minor, as you said, the GI side effects. These are the major side effects.
Yeah. So I think most of it is related to, this is one for you. If the patient is on renal replacement therapy, how should we dose daptomycin?
Yeah, the daptomycin dose is, it depends upon the clinical status of the patient, point number one. Another one is, it depends upon the situation that we deal with. If it's going to be a bacteremia, the septic shock, generally you would not modify the dose much. So in those kind of patients, you may require 8 to 10 milligram per kilogram of daptomycin. With CRRT, you may have to not reduce the dose and probably give a higher dose. Someone with a chronic kidney disease with hemodialysis, with predictable kinetics with respect to glomerular filtration, you know that it's going to be less than 10 or less than 30 ml per minute, then you can go for dose reduction. With CRRT, probably we may have to maintain the same dose with daptomycin.
Yeah. So other questions regarding COVID, role of lopinavir and ritonavir, I think that is getting de-emphasized now because that NEJM article showed really no benefit. So I think it's not increasingly being preferred in our, now with these newer antivirals. And strategies which modulate cytokine storm syndrome. So that I think we can have a separate discussion on that. Should we continue methylprednisolone after giving tocilizumab? Any thoughts on that, Senthur?
I think we should use both. That is the practice right now. So tocilizumab is not like that you're going to give for 5-7 days, just 2 or 3 doses maximum. So people would give both the drugs at the same time.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's about it. We have covered most of the questions. Any advice for pharma professional in this COVID situation? So is that an offbeat question? Any precautions, advice for pharma professionals in this COVID situation? Senthur, you want to have comments on that?
I think I don't think you're going to give a specific advice for pharma guys. Probably doctors like you and me are at the biggest risk. So they can stay at home and promote and then avoid coming to hospitals. We don't have that choice. I think the simple advice is mask. Use mask. That's the best thing. And in case anyone falls sick, either go to the doctor or stay at home if you're doing well. So let's not keep working when you have symptoms. That's the best thing that we could do for others actually.
Yeah, I think I agree. I've been telling all my pharma friends not to come. The reason why we are worried is you may be visiting many hospitals and that is a clear risk for you also and for others also whom you may be visiting. So it is the time for virtual meetings. So you can have a virtual appointment with doctors and do it in a virtual way. But definitely visiting in person may not be suggested or may not be encouraged is what I would say. it is in the best interest of yourself and for all others. So I think we are done with most questions. So I think we have exceeded by 15-20 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll end the question answer session, and I will hand over to Dr. Anup Dixit to conclude with vote of thanks. And thanks, Santur, for excellent discussion. I think we had a great discussion. We had good number of people participating. I'm sure the questions on COVID will continue to linger in everyone's mind, and answers are as nebulous as anyone else. But the only spirit that we need to live by is to update ourselves with all the scientific evidence, because it is only the science that can beat this battle, or that beat this virus and win over this battle. So over to you, Anup.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep. So just the brief introduction, what Concord is all about. Concord actually is based at Ahmedabad. We have got the formulation facility. We have got API facility. As far as the API is concerned, I would like to highlight here that the API, that is active pharmaceutical ingredient, what we manufacture, they are manufacturing by the process called fermentation. And this particular process of fermentation is actually nothing but we develop and grow bacteria. They produce the raw material and we convert into the API. This particular very well accepted by the global market. You can see that in the last 20 years, we have awarded with the GMP certifications, and also with Japan FDA and the Korean FDA. That is a region we are growing very fast from 2000 to 2020. We have got a vertically integrated biotechnology company having state-of-the-art manufacturing facility for both fermentation, semi-synthetic API, at the same time also the finished dosage forms. It is managed by the team with microbiologists, biotechnologists, chemists, pharmacists, engineers, and the management experts. We have got international experts and international presence in 50 countries. This fermentation process is very, very important to understand, because whatever product like high value antibiotics like daptomycin, fosfomycin, polymyxin B, teicoplanin. At the same time, we are also manufacturing API for the high value antifungals like anidulafungin, micafungin, also caspofungin, and these particular API, which is having a global quality standards and saving patient life, being used for our finished product also. That's a reason we are having a presence in 50 countries across the globe. We are working hard to implementing the Indian strategy that we vocal for local. So we want to give you the world-class quality in terms of API, and the evidence is in front of you that's a region we are present in USA, in Europe, in Australia, in Asian countries, including Japan. And that's a region they are accepting because of the quality part. It is like the natural and very good quality API and finished products. So that for that reason, we also would like to serve our patients, Indian patients, providing the global quality standards and saving the patient life. This is all about the Concord Biotech Limited. I personally would like to give a big thanks to Dr. Pradeep Rangappa and Dr. P. Senthur Nambi for the wonderful presentations you made. There are a lot of questions. I think doctors, those who have attended these particular two presentations, would like to get in touch with you in person also for getting the answers of those questions. So it was a very, very interactive sessions. I'm very happy to be here and could get the lot of insight of these presentations. Thank you so much, Dr. Pradeep. Thank you so much, Dr. Senthur, and delegates for your time, for your login. Thanks very much for your present here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Senthur. Thank you, Dr. Anup.
Yeah, thank you,
everyone.
Yeah. Good night.
Excellent. Night.
Thank you.